Welcome back to Dead Reckoning TV. I'm Dr. Brian Matson. Today, on our Above the Pay Grade segment, we are welcoming back to Dead Reckoning TV our Washington correspondent, I like to call her that, Hadley Heath from the Independent Women's Forum. Hadley, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been a busy time in Washington. The big Hobby Lobby oral argument happened in the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday, and I know that you, at the Independent Women's Forum, you've been doing a lot of work. You all filed an amicus brief with the court on the Hobby Lobby case. You and I are the kinds of people who are really into this sort of thing, and we know what's going on. So many people are not news junkies like we are. Can you give me a brief overview of what is this case even all about?
Well, one of the goals of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was to make sure that not just everybody has insurance, but everybody has a particular kind of insurance that covers a certain threshold of healthcare services. And within the law was a request for the Department of Health and Human Services to spell out what does that mean to have essential health benefits. And one of the decisions made within that agency was that every healthcare plan had to include coverage for all FDA-approved contraceptive methods and services. And this includes plans that are provided by employers. So we've got a lot of parties involved here. We've got the government, insurance companies, employers, and then consumers and patients. So there are some employers who, not surprisingly to you and me, looked through the list of FDA-approved contraceptive methods and found several that they found morally objectionable because of their religious views. These companies are run by people who are pro-life. They believe that 4 of the drugs that were required can act after an egg is fertilized and can terminate that fertilized egg. So they believe this is equivalent to an abortion. They've asked for an exemption. They've asked for this mandate to be relieved of them. But so far in the courts, the lower courts have come to different decisions about whether or not these corporations or family-owned businesses have a right to choose what kind of health insurance coverage to offer their employees. And that's what was heard at the Supreme Court yesterday.
So just to summarize what you just said, Hadley, you don't think women should have birth control?
Yeah, that's right. No, I absolutely believe women should be able to seek out and purchase the types of birth control that are right for them. That was the case before Obamacare. That was the case before this mandate. And that would be the case if this mandate were to be repealed or struck down by the court.
It seems that in so many of our debates these days, and maybe this is just one of the side effects of having an increasingly large and intrusive federal government, is that so many of these debates we're having, whether it be photographers and bakers, for having to, serve same-sex weddings. You've got now this contraception mandate. It seems like what we've got are parties jockeying to have the government force somebody to give me something that I want. Isn't that what's going on here?
Right. And in front of the Supreme Court yesterday, just like there was in 2012 when the Supreme Court heard a different challenge to the Affordable Care Act along the lines of the individual mandate, there were protesters on either side. And the protesters on the side of Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood, those are the 2 corporations challenging the mandate. Then on the other side, there were people holding up signs. These were mostly protesters from Planned Parenthood and other pro-abortion groups, saying that their birth control was not their boss's business. And actually, the irony for me there is I agree with them that their birth control shouldn't be their boss's business. But when you ask or force your boss to participate in the payment for your birth control drugs and services, then it becomes his business. So really what women who prefer to have a private relationship between their doctor, their pharmacist, and themselves would be to cut employers out of that coverage entirely and cut maybe even insurance companies don't have to be a party to that. But under Obamacare, of course, the requirement is that all insurance plans do cover those services.
It's a very complex case. I enjoyed actually reading the transcript of the arguments yesterday. I don't think it went well, actually, for the Solicitor General arguing the administration's position. I don't think it went well at all. It sounded to me even that Justice Breyer seemed dubious about the government's case. It's very complex in a lot of issues. One of them is, how can a corporation exercise religious beliefs? That's one of the big questions. What say you, Hadley Heath? Can they? Should they?
Well, right. That's one of the many issues at stake, and that has to do with the First Amendment grounds for this case. Remember, there's two important grounds. One is the First Amendment, another is a statute from 1993 called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and we can talk about that more later. That's even more complicated. But on First Amendment grounds, obviously every person in the United States, as we think of people, individuals, has a right to free exercise of religion. The question is, to what extent are these corporations acting as persons? And even within that question, there's another question. How do we differentiate closely held corporations like Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood, which are family-owned, family businesses where the stakeholders are few and very identifiable, versus publicly held corporations, which the court may decide in this case to make a ruling that's more narrowly tailored to those closely held family businesses, rather than talking, more broadly about the personhood of all corporations. So that's something that is at stake in this case, but the court could very easily sidestep that question.
I think you're right about that. I don't think they're going to make a big ruling about, how ExxonMobil is going to exercise their religious rights. But isn't it interesting, Hadley, that the argument we're constantly hearing from the left is that corporations don't have consciences, that they don't have souls, that they don't, that they do everything just to make a buck. And now we have a corporation that has a conscience, and they're getting punished for it.
Right. I think one of the justices was sort of cornering the Solicitor General yesterday, when he or she, I'm not sure which justice, asked, so do you believe that the sole purpose of a corporation is to maximize profit? Because that's really one of the questions here. And also, you mentioned whether or not corporations have souls or have principles. Absolutely. We've seen other corporations that don't even operate under the banner of any specific religion. They have a reputation for supporting certain values. Maybe it's being environmentally friendly. Maybe it's being socially responsible. That's a very common buzzword. But it seems like the real hot button in this case has to do with the fact that contraceptives have to do with sex and sexual values, and that's why it's become, unfortunately, a part of the culture wars. But let's remember who the aggressor was in this case in the culture war. It was this mandate that changed the equation. Many women who worked for Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood were very happy with the health insurance coverage they had before this mandate, and it's unfortunate now that we've come to this place of seeing this intention.
Well, yeah, what about Justices Kagan and Sotomayor yesterday were just making these really amazing comments, and I want to get your reaction to it. It was basically, look, nobody's forcing Hobby Lobby to do anything. I mean, really, they have an alternative. The alternative is drop all their health care plans and just pay a fine, pay a tax.
Right. Well, those would be just incredibly high fines when you consider the fines under Obamacare for any business of more than 50 workers. If you don't provide adequate and affordable health care coverage as defined by the Affordable Care Act, you would pay $2,000 per worker per year. And really ironic, if you do provide health insurance coverage, but you disobey this mandate with regard to contraceptive services, you could pay $100 per worker per day, not even per year, but per day. So that's $36,500 per worker per year. When you consider that Hobby Lobby might employ up to 20,000 people nationwide, that's enough. That would be over $400 million in fines for them per year.
I got a big kick out of when I think it was Kagan was really pressing Paul Clement. It was really pressing him about, they could just pay this fine and it'll be less money than the health insurance stuff. And he kept saying, well, that's $26 million a year. And she almost seemed to not believe him. And she kept saying, well, no, really. And he's like, that's $26 million. Like, maybe you're not aware of how many people we employ.
Right.
It's incredible. But she was acting as though this is not burdensome to you as a corporation. And it just struck me as an amazing suggestion from a Supreme Court justice that you can exercise your religious liberties and your religious conscience. It's just going to cost you a tax. Is this the United States of America that we're in?
Right. Well, I remember when the Supreme Court ruled on the individual mandate. I think one reason so many Americans, even if they sort of liked the idea of Obamacare, they liked the idea of health insurance for everyone, they really rejected the individual mandate because so far in our country, before 2010, we hadn't had any laws that punished you for not buying something. And I sort of see the Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood cases in a very similar vein. Not only now are we asking these corporations to buy something that they don't want to buy, we're asking them to buy something that goes against their moral and religious consciences. And that seems very antithetical to the American idea.
Yeah, I thought that the most impressive moment in the hearing was Justice Alito bringing up to the Solicitor General the problem that in Denmark they just banned kosher butchers because of inhumane treatment of animals. And they said, would such a corporation in America, were that to happen, would they have standing under this law, RFRA law, to challenge this? And Solicitor General essentially had it. Well, no, that's really where this law leads.
Right. And the analogies were coming from both sides. I mean, we heard from the more liberal justices, will a ruling in favor of the law's challengers result in the end of blood transfusions and the end of vaccinations? I mean, it was a list of terribles that they brought out. And as you mentioned earlier, those fines of $20 million or $400 million a year, that I think is going to be very hard for the government to dispute in terms of a substantial burden on religious freedom. But the other two questions in the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act are, is this a compelling government interest? And thirdly, and this is another place I think the government really tripped up yesterday, is this the least restrictive means to reach that goal? And any question about whether or not employers can be forced to provide coverage for vaccinations or blood transfusions, Paul Clement made it very clear that those cases would have to be weighed in light of the specific merits of those cases. I think there's a much stronger case for a compelling government interest in vaccinations than there is contraception. But finally, that third question, is this the least restrictive means? That's one thing we touch on in our amicus brief. No, you could do a lot of other things to allow women more affordability or more direct access to these birth control services besides having to involve religious employers who have a moral objection to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the second point that you were mentioning is also a hurdle that the government did not clear, and that is, can you establish that this is such a compelling interest? Well, there's a built-in problem with that, and that is they've granted all of these exemptions to all sorts of other grandfathered plans that don't provide the contraception. So it's very difficult for them to argue, now this is so compelling, we've just got to have this done. And I thought the majority of the justices seemed skeptical of that.
Right. Over 100 million health plans have been exempted from the Affordable Care Act's requirements for secular reasons or other reasons. And obviously, we have in the United States a good structure of churches and houses of worship that are also subject to an exemption from this type of rule. So if it's not so strong a compelling government interest that they've already exempted 100 million plans, then we might ask that maybe they exempt several more corporations, people like Hobby Lobby, and the over 300 other plaintiffs who have filed this specific type of case. These are family businesses in most cases, or organizations, nonprofits even, groups of nuns like Little Sisters of the Poor,
right,
who do very great services for their community, whether it's a hospital or a school, or in the case of Hobby Lobby, I mean, they've been providing arts and crafts products and providing jobs in communities across the United States for years. They have a great track record of being a great company. And these are not the kind of companies we want to run out of business because they don't want to disobey their religious conscience.
Yeah, it just strikes me as this is just another one of these unintended or perhaps intended consequences of Obamacare and passing a piece of legislation nobody reads. We had to pass it to find out what's in it. Well, I guess now we know what's in it. And even worse is that this wasn't even in it.
Right. And Justice Kennedy mentioned that at least twice yesterday. He seemed to be troubled by the fact that this was a decision made within an executive department rather than voted on in the light of day by the representatives of the people in Congress. So he seems to be troubled by the fact that this, such a weighty First Amendment issue would be decided behind closed doors by bureaucrats instead of by our representatives.
Yeah, that's right. You and the Independent Women's Forum have a great interest in Obamacare, all of these various issues that keep cropping up, and you run a website that is dedicated to that topic. Where can our viewers find this material?
You can visit healthcarelawsuits.org, or you can visit our flagship website, which is iwf.org. You can read our amicus brief. I think our amicus brief makes some really great points that nobody else is making. For one thing, remember that women have to pay for these drugs through their insurance premiums. Even if they're mandated for coverage, even if they're mandated for first dollar coverage, we just lose out on the price transparency and the price competition that comes along with the freedom to choose what's in our plans. So besides being an unconstitutional policy, I think this HHS mandate is actually working contrary to women's interests. And you can read more about that.
Wow. That's an interesting point that you're making, that it's not just unconstitutional, it's actually bad policy. Tell me a little bit more. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Right. Well, we oppose all kinds of coverage mandates at the Independent Women's Forum because those coverage mandates simply restrict consumer choice. They don't allow us to personalize our healthcare plans. Remember, not every woman uses every one of these drugs, and she may want to choose coverage for some or not any or all of the above. And when we talk about employer health benefits too, this gets into our employment freedom. Any mandated benefit from an employer really takes away our flexibility to negotiate away from that benefit towards something else we might want, like higher compensation or more flexibility on the job. So this is just a one-size-fits-all government solution to something that is actually very personal and very individual for women. I just think it's unwise for women to put something that's so personal and something that we want to have personal control over in the hands of a government that so far hasn't been able to make the best decisions for us in other areas. This something that is so personal to women. Why would we let Uncle Sam decide which drugs are in and which drugs are out?
Isn't it interesting, Hadley? The mantra used to be, keep the government out of my bedroom. Now they're like inviting them in the front door. Isn't that what we're doing?
That's right. And there's so many parties, as I mentioned earlier, insurers, employers. These people, along with the government, have to be middlemen to a decision that should be between me and my doctor. You know, the morning after pill, for example, that's one piece of emergency contraception that Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood are opposed to providing coverage for. That's actually available in your pharmacy without a prescription. So the argument that women don't have access to these drugs, I think sort of falls flat. Women do have access to these drugs, and they can go buy them at a pharmacy. You know, here's something really ironic to me about healthcare, and it's hard for people who maybe don't know a lot about the history of health insurance in our country, but there have been a lot of state level coverage mandates for all different types of things, and they haven't always had public health in mind. Sometimes these are just special interest groups in the health sector who approach politicians and say, look, my service is so important, I want you to mandate coverage for it. And this works out well for both politicians who say, look, I care about my constituents, and the special interests who are selling the drugs and services. But now we have coverage mandates at the national level, right? So we won't be able to see anymore how states with fewer coverage mandates actually had more competitive health insurance premiums. They had a greater diversity in health insurance policies. And those products that are left outside of mandated coverage typically are more affordable because there's downward pressure on price, because consumers have some skin in the game. Even if I have a copay for my birth control, I'm paying more attention to how much the product costs. I'm comparing it with other products. There's some price competition. But the HHS mandate completely removes price competition. And I think the real winners here, maybe, Brian, from the HHS mandate will be the pharmaceutical companies and the drug companies that are selling these drugs. Now that there's a middleman between the consumer and the producer of the drugs, I won't be able to see how much these things are costing me. I won't be able to pay.
The evil pharmaceutical companies who don't have consciences are the ones who are going to benefit at the end of the day? Oh, say it isn't so, Hadley Heath. Say it isn't so.
You know, I think
liberals' heads are exploding all over the world because you just said that.
Yeah, I think pharmaceutical companies, like other companies, are offering a product, right? And it ought to be up to consumers to decide what the value is for that product. But when you do have government mandating that insurance companies play such a big role in the payment, you essentially have an outsized role for a middleman or a third party payer. And again, that takes away my ability as a consumer to weigh, is this worth it for me? And that's a huge problem in healthcare, not just in birth control or other pharmaceuticals. It's a problem all across the health sector
Right.
because you can't walk into a hospital and say, how much is this going to cost me?
Right.
You know?
No genuine price discovery in the healthcare market. I see
Right.
that as one of the major problems. And you're making just a great point. Mandates always remove flexibility, economic flexibility from a market. And
Right.
that's a great point. And this is all in the IWF's amicus brief.
That's right. And
Fan-
flexibility, I'm sure flexibility is important to you, Brian, but flexibility is a value that women point to over and over again as we try to achieve that work life balance. A lot of women do want to spend more time in the home raising kids or, balancing their career with outside of work activities.
Right.
And that flexibility is so precious to us. I hope that we don't give it up by allowing these mandates to move forward.
That's great. So IWF.org, we can find that brief. You also run healthcarelawsuits.org, which is dedicated to Obamacare lawsuits and all these unintended consequences of a gargantuan law nobody ever read before they passed, and the nasty surprises that are popping out. So our viewers can go check out Hadley's writing on IWF.org, also healthcarelawsuits.org. Hadley, thanks so much for coming on Dead Reckoning
Thank you.
again. It's great to see you.
Great to see you too.
We
Thanks
hope
for
to have
having
you
me.
again.
Sounds good.
All right. Good.